Hello, everyone. Welcome to Carpet City Cinema, a Gila Films podcast. I'm David Weaver, and we are now 3 months in on this whole new endeavor I mentioned a while ago of switching over from a 9-to-5 job that I hated to something that's a little more tolerable, the art of reselling. And, the whole goal of that, as I mentioned before, was to try to free up some time. It was kind of becoming impossible to both juggle the reselling, which was a side hustle, with my full-time job and get anything done moving forward on Gila Films projects. It was really grinding things down to a halt. And finally, are definitely seeing some real progress. Going in on this 3-month mark, we've finally checked off everything we need to do with the Blu-ray. We've got the podcast kind of going up more at a more consistent rate. Squared away the still somewhat secret The Last Frankenstein art piece that we will be revealing hopefully sooner rather than later. Something that will be available for people to purchase. Really impressive piece of art, especially created for us and touching on the film. And as soon as I find out how best to go about having that printed up, and then we'll be able to actually reveal that art design and put it up for purchase on the website. And now finally this week, really kind of digging at long last back into the screenplay for the sequel and diving more into the research that's necessary for that. So it is good to finally see things kind of come together and become reality. The plan is actually coming together. It was a dark week for fans of film. We lost two pretty big names for those who are interested in the classic era, and even going up to modern days, actually. One of them, the more classic era, one of the two, though, was Don Murray, the Academy Award-nominated actor who nabbed his Oscar nom for his very first film, the 1956 William Inge adaptation, Bus Stop, which is the movie that some people kind of look at as showcasing that Marilyn Monroe, who's the star of the movie, could actually had true dramatic acting ability, not just looks, not just comedic timing, but also had true dramatic talent. And Murray was her co-star in that, and right off the bat, nominated Best Supporting Actor nom. And the film also starred Hope Lange, who Murray was married to for a while back in the day. But he wanted to have a pretty good career, a lot of noteworthy performances in films like A Hatful of Rain, which is a film that deals with drug addiction, and it was a movie I really watched a lot in my youth. Just, that's what all kids in the 90s do, is they watch 1950s drug addiction movies. But hey, it was a movie I was a big fan of and kind of introduced me to Tony Franciosa, an actor who I've gone on to become a big fan of. He was also in The Bachelor Party, not the Tom Hanks one, but this is the late 50s Paddy Chayefsky adaptation. He was in Advising Consent, Otto Preminger's film, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. A lot of people know him from that in the science fiction fan base. He played the villain of the piece, so to speak, Governor Breck. He even showed up in a Hammer Films entry, The Viking Queen, and did some directing too. Probably best known directing wise for The Cross and the Switchblade, which was kind of a religious themed film that also has kind of a footnote in history for being marking the debut performance of the great Eric Estrada. But Murray's career really was kind of that first 10 years after Bus Stop was when he was really on the rise. And he continued to act right up until his passing. But that was really kind of his peak, was that first 10-year period. But continued to work on the small screen. He was known for his recurring role on Knots Landing, and also was on the Twin Peaks revival. But incredibly long and very varied career. And he passed away age 94. And then the other one that even newer audience would be more familiar with is, of course, we lost, unfortunately, Carl Weathers, age 76. Of course, Apollo Creed in the Rocky films, and the star of movies like Predator and Action Jackson. His career starts in the early 70s. He was in the NFL for a couple seasons with the Raiders, played a year in the Canadian Football League, but then got into acting and really established himself with the first Rocky film. But throughout the 70s and 80s, showed up in a lot of different action movies, and also was on the TV series In the Heat of the Night, as well as some other shows. And then in the 90s, with his performance in Happy Gilmore, the Adam Sandler movie, kind of reintroduced himself to people all over again, and because by that time, the Rocky franchise, I mean, his character, obviously, as we all know, had died in the fourth one, but just the Rocky franchise as a whole was kind of, in stagnant waters, and his cachet with the audiences was a little more maybe past its prime, but that kind of like seemed to reinvigorate things, and gone on to just have even success with another generation beyond that with his role in The Mandalorian. And that actually is the series that finally got him an Emmy nomination. And showed up in other films too throughout the years. He was actually in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He was in Force 10 from Navarone. He was in Death Hunt with Charles Bronson and Lee Marvin. So just incredible body of work. He was also on, I'm a big fan of Law & Order, but Dick Wolf, also, who produces the Law & Order series, also has his Chicago franchise. And Weathers was on some of those different installments in that franchise. So sorry to see him leave us. Incredible body of work, and just truly an actor. You can't just be big to have a presence in films. It takes more than just size. There's a lot of people with athletic backgrounds that have tried unsuccessfully to make the transition to becoming actors. But Weathers was definitely one who had not just the physique, but also the ability to utilize it, who had the acting talent to just be more than just a big body in the room. And really glad that he finally did get that recognition with The Mandalorian near the end, because it's good to see them finally tip the hat to his acting abilities and realize that he was just more than just a jacked up, cut guy who looked like he could kick your butt. And lastly, the British BAFTA-nominated actor Michael Jayston passed away, age 88. An actor with a really rich background in stage, who never quite achieved the breakout role kind of fame in film that perhaps his career had been looking for, because he was in his big role in film that drew a lot of attention to him was as Tsar Nicholas II in Nicholas and Alexandra, the 1971 big budget epic film about the Russian Revolution. And that was a film that had a lot of the kind of people behind it that there was hope and expectation that it would be a huge success. It was directed by Franklin J. Schaffner, who was just coming off the Best Director win he had for Patton. It was produced by Sam Spiegel, who was at least a 3-time Best Picture Oscar winner. He had produced The African Queen, On the Waterfront, The Bridge on the River Kwai, and Lawrence of Arabia. So he had the sweeping historical epic with all these huge names attached to it. And when it came out, it got kind of lukewarm reviews and was a big financial bust. It lost the studio, Columbia Pictures, millions of dollars, and so that kind of prevented him, regardless of what people thought of his own performance, from really kind of achieving that kind of leading man status in film that perhaps, if the film had been more successful, he would have earned. But still, very familiar actor to audiences just for his work. For example, on TV, he was a regular on the popular British show Emmerdale Farm, and for fans of genre television, he was on the original Doctor Who. During the 6th Doctor run, they had a whole story arc over one of the seasons called The Trial of a Time Lord, where the Doctor, played by Colin Baker, was put on trial, and Jayston played the character who is the prosecutor. He also starred in the classic 1979 miniseries adaptation of John Le Carre, or Carr, I don't know I'm probably totally butchering that guy's name, but Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He was in that. He also played Rochester in the BBC's adaptation 1973 of Jane Eyre. And some of his other movies, noteworthy ones, were the musical 70s adaptation of Alice in Wonderland that was made in Britain called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. He was in the adaptation of Harold Pinter's The Homecoming, and also showed up in some horror films too that people might know, British horror films like Tales That Witness Madness, which was an anthology horror film, and Craze. Those were both directed by the great Freddie Francis. Also was in Michael Anderson's Dominique, another late 70s horror film with Cliff Robertson. So, definitely a career that he had the career where he was respected for his craft, and like I said, had a really known presence on stage, and more so on the small screen, like I said, than in cinema, where he was probably looked at overall more as a supporting player. Um, but hey, Nicholas Alexandra, I do want. That's what I really like to check out. It's one that Twilight Time tackled before I really kind of knew what who Twilight Time was. They were a physical media label that would do runs of Blu-ray where they would do a limited number of units, and you have to buy it before it went out of print. And that was just it. There were no more copies of them usually, and I didn't really kind of become aware of Twilight Time until after some of those earlier titles had kind of gone out of print, like Nicholas and Alexandra. And good label Twilight Time. They still exist, although it's kind of different. Has a different modus operandi than when it originally started, because one of the main people behind it has passed on. But yeah, I still got to track that down and pick that up one of these days because I do want it. I do want to see it, especially since growing up, I was a fan of Doctor Who, the old Doctor Who episodes. I had an uncle who watched it a lot, and my brother and I then would watch the tapes he had, and they were mostly of Tom Baker, the actor who played the fourth Doctor, which was the longest running of the Doctors. So he was the actor who played the Doctor more than anyone else, and he was considered the most popular. And Baker is in Nicholas and Alexandra as Rasputin, and this was before he moved on to Doctor Who. So I've always been kind of interested in seeing it just because of that. It was also an early film. It might have actually been the first film that Brian Cox was in. Definitely was a very early performance I know of his. So I do want to check that out at some point. Moving on to new releases, exciting news that Film Masters, a label we've talked up a lot, is partnering with Something Weird Video on an upcoming release. So Something Weird Video is one of the giants in the physical media world when it comes to cult cinema. Started back in the VHS day and moved on to DVDs. They were started by the great Mike Vraney, who passed away several years ago, way too young, only about 60. And his widow, Lisa Petrucci, who was very active in the company while he was alive, has continued to carry on the mantle. They had just an incredible, just a massive collection of film elements and titles. And, as time has gone on, she's basically tried to, that's a very difficult thing to manage as a, kind of a one-person operation. So she's been partnering with a lot of other labels to get these movies out. They've got a whole line of product that Kino Lorber has been putting out in collaboration with her. They've worked with Seven Films. They even have worked with Criterion. They had Brian De Palma's early film Murder a la Mode, which was included on the Criterion release of Blowout. And so it's great to see that she is now teaming up with Film Masters. I believe this is the first release that they're partnering on, and it's called a Backwoods Double Feature. Going to include two films making their Blu-ray debut, which had previously been released by Something Weird Video, at least on DVD. And the first one is on this double feature is Common Law Wife. These are both kind of like basically hillbilly exploitation movies or redneck exploitation, whatever you want to call it. But Common Law Wife, I wasn't familiar with, just reading up about it. And basically, it was a film that came out in 1961. And it started as a movie called Swamp Rose, which was shot in 1960 by Larry Buchanan, who fans of cult cinema are very familiar with. He was a filmmaker out of Texas who's kind of best known for a couple different phases in his career. In the late 60s, AIP, American International Pictures, hired him to basically remake a bunch of their earlier 50s movies on in an even lower budget than they had originally been made on. And he did so. So he took like It Conquered the World and remade it as Xantar the Thing from Venus. He took The She Creature and remade it as Creature of Destruction, and so on and so forth. And then he also kind of had this reputation, Buchanan, for doing these kind of like really low budget biopics. He did one on Jean Harlow and Howard Hughes. Hughes and Harlow, Angels in Hell, I think it was called. He did one called Down on Us about like Hendrix and Joplin and Jim Morrison. But yeah, early in his career, this was one of the titles he worked on. And I don't know if the film was finished. It was unreleased, this original film, Swamp Rose, that Buchanan made. And apparently, Common Law Wife is another director coming along and shooting new footage, combining it with that, and then releasing this film. So definitely sounds like the kind of mangled up, botched operation that I would love to check out. And the other movie on this Blu-ray is from 1968. It's titled Jenny, Wife/Child. So you can figure that one out, I think, what kind of areas that's going to touch on. And these were actually released, I know there was Something Weird Video would release titles on burn on demand discs through their website, so where you could get basically access to just about anything they had. They had at least some kind of transfer on, even if it was just an old VHS transfer. But some of them they released on these double and triple feature DVDs, press discs releases that were distributed by Image Entertainment. So these two films, Common Law Wife and Jenny Wife Child, they had actually been part of one of those Image Entertainment double feature DVDs. So basically, Film Masters is going to come in and just bring that into the high def world, and very excited about that, as well as what could come of this in the future, because there just is a ridiculous amount of product that Something Weird Video has that I don't, it's kind of almost concerning that, like, is it all ever going to make it out to disc? Because some of it's really, really on the fringe in terms of like exploitation with, like, totally no name casts, and just not even really well known among the more active genre fans. So hopefully everything will eventually make its way into the sunlight through Something Weird Video's various partnerships. All right, we're cutting right now into our movie of the week. This time we went to the 80s, 1981, to watch the Peter Yates movie Eyewitness, starring William Hurt and Sigourney Weaver. So the film is a suspense movie in which Hurt plays a janitor at a large office building, who comes upon the murdered remains of one of the tenants, a man of Vietnamese heritage, which comes into play. It's of note that is his ancestry. A man of Vietnamese heritage who basically was kind of a broker in the darker sections of the world. A guy who basically could a fixer, basically a guy who could get things done for you, a buyer and seller of information, a rather shady man, shall we say. And Hurt comes across his body and is concerned that this crime may have been perpetrated by a friend of his, played by James Woods, who had recently been fired from his job, working also as a janitor at this building, because of an altercation he had with this murdered man, and also because the two of them had served together in the Vietnam War, and this guy who was killed had been someone who was willing to sell out information to either sides of that conflict. So, Hurt is reluctant to basically broadcast that he came across this body, that he found this guy dead, or that he's in any way connected to this incident, because he's afraid of implicating his pal. That being said, Hurt also has had a long-time crush on this local news anchor, played by Sigourney Weaver, and realizes that by kind of like leading her on about that he might know something about this crime, that he can maybe strike up a relationship with her, and is hoping to kind of pursue that. Meanwhile, the police are kind of getting on to the idea that Hurt might know more than he's letting on. And because of that, they also begin to suspect James Woods as perhaps being involved in this crime. These cops, the two cops who are in charge of the case, played by Morgan Freeman, a pre-stardom Morgan Freeman, and Stephen Hill, who you might know as DA Adam Schiff on Law & Order. This was a little less than a decade before he landed that role, and after he had been the star of the first season of the original Mission Impossible. So they're kind of, on this case, and, their suspicions are being raised. And then there is the murderer, whoever that may be. I shall not divulge any spoilers, but that's individual or individuals also. It's not going to let the situation stay as it is. So this film was a reunion for the director and the screenwriter. It was directed by Peter Yates, the excellent British filmmaker who did such classic films as The Friends of Eddie Coyle. He did The Dresser, which came after this, with Albert Finney and Tom Courtenay. And he directed one of my all-time favorite films, Bullet, with Steve McQueen. And prior to directing this movie, the film that had come out right before this that he had done was the classic 1979 coming-of-age flick Breaking Away, which is a big hit. Won Best Screenplay Oscar, was nominated for like Best Picture and Director. a big stepping stone in the careers of like Daniel Stern and Dennis Quaid. And the writer of that, who had taken home an Oscar, was Steve Tessich. And this film brought those two back together, Yates and Tessich. It would be the second of 3 collaborations they would do. They also worked together on the film Eleni a couple years after this. And it's interesting and totally makes sense that the origins of this film were that Tessich was working on 2 different scripts, and it was Yates's idea to say, "Wow, you can't get either of these scripts off the ground. Just combine them, put them into one movie, and we'll make that as a film, which will be Eyewitness." And I read that after watching the movie, but you kind of knew that while you were watching the movie. This film is so clearly 2 different flicks that are someone is trying to attempt to weave into one. There's movie A, which is William Hurt, returning decorated Vietnam vet, trying to readjusting to civilian life, enjoying his just kind of by the numbers, challengeless 9-to-5 job. He's got a buddy who is also in the military with him, James Woods, and who is trying to hook him up with his sister and wants to have like the kind of family connection between him and Hurt. And they have ideas of maybe opening up their own business, and it's just following this guy also with his own family life, the issues between his own parents who have kind of a troubled marriage. His father's in a wheelchair, played by the great character actor Kenneth McMillan, who people may know from his recurring role in later seasons of Rhoda or from Dune or Salem's Lot, but terrific character actor, one of my faves from that era. So that's like movie A. Movie B is the whole janitor comes across a murdered guy in an office building, doesn't want to let on what he knows until he realizes it might help him win the affections of a popular, lovely-looking lady. And this, of course, all results in conflict with both police and whoever the killer is. And it is so incredibly apparent that these 2 movies just are coming from these 2 different aspects of the narrative are coming from different worlds. That it's not organic that the 2 faces of this film should belong together. I mean, there are deviations the narrative takes just to spend time with William Hurt interacting with his dad, and just these kind of like very character driven moments, which is fine. I have no problem with those kind of moments in a film which is supposed to be suspense or genre or horror, but it never feels natural. It always feels like we're opening up a door and stepping out of movie A and going into movie B, and then when it's time to go back into suspense mode, we open up that door again and go back. It never feels homogenous at all. These transitions between the suspense film and the character-driven drama film, and even you have a whole this whole subplot about James Woods hoping that William Hurt will hook up with his sister, played by the lovely Pamela Reed, early in her career. And again, those scenes, which are kind of played for comic relief, they just feel tonally completely out of whack with the suspense parts of the movie. I think it would have worked had those kind of comedic moments been in the more drama character-driven film, if that had gotten off the ground and been made just as in and of itself. But it put in the same pot with the suspense movie, it just seems really kind of jarring to have those moments happen. But complicating the things too is that not only do you have this strange mixture of a suspense movie and this drama movie, is also the fact the suspense movie doesn't work. I would say the drama movie doesn't work either, but it is stronger than the suspense film. I mean, this movie really struggles to generate tension or any kind of stakes. You never really feel like Hurt's character is at risk, nor do you really care, I think, either what happens to his character. And the moments that are kind of suspense driven, they kind of, the moments that would be kind of classically make their way into a trailer where if you do watch the trailer, you can see this, scenes with, him in a car chase or him being attacked by a dog, or there's a scene where he's in a compactor and it turns on, these. And this isn't spoiler territory. This is all in the trailer. Trust me. They just the way they're constructed, and the way that they play out. They just never really build up any sense of suspense or concern for what's going to happen to the character. They're just kind of like thrown in there, obligatory, almost as if they're obligatory action beats or suspense beats. Like, we've gone this long in the movie, we spent 15 minutes, pushing forward these character moments or trying to advance the plot. We need to have a suspense scene or sequence in this film in order to really sell it as a suspense film. So let's just throw in a car chase, or let's just have this happen. And like I said, it never feels like something that's genuinely putting the character at risk, or making you feel that they're at risk, or making you feel on the edge. And Yates talked about later on about how he identified that was what Tessa, the screenwriter, really struggled with. He said he's really good at really depicting these characters, but the suspense aspects of the film was what he really struggled with, which kind of, obviously he came off the Oscar for Breaking Away, which is a film which is all about character and drama and spending time with people, leisurely. So I don't know. It's kind of like, why did you encourage this to happen, Peter Yates? Why did you say, hey, my buddy screenwriter, who is just won the Oscar for a drama and has a drama script and a suspense script that he's not able to move forward on, and he's not really good at suspense. Let's just make this movie anyways. I don't know. Maybe that's kind of like the whole thing where you're riding high off a hit, because like I said, Yates got nominated for 2 nominations, Best Picture and Director, because he's a producer on Breaking Away. Maybe he just felt like, we can make this happen. We'll be unstoppable with this, but it just never comes together. And it's interesting too. I mean, part of this is just watching this film through a modern day, a contemporary lens, is the whole idea of Hurt basically trying to put the moves on this reporter who's like Sigourney Weaver plays a very successful television reporter who comes from a very affluent family too, and he kind of, when he sees her at the crime scene, and he kind of leads her on that he'd like to talk to her about the what happened in this building. And then she's like, oh, okay. And she gets her crew together and they go over to his side of the building and start filming him. And then he just immediately starts putting the moves on her and telling her how he's got a big crush on her. I mean, these days that would be like complete stalker material. He'd be like, oh, easy, bud. And I'm not someone who watches these movies and really sees them through the way, who examines them necessarily through the way we view things now. I can take into account the context of the times. So when I saw this, when I saw Hurt's behavior in the scene and throughout the film as he's really kind of pursuing this relationship with her, and it really kind of stood out as really kind of strange. I'm like, am I just being, do I have some kind of subconscious bias where I'm just basically reacting to this because in this day and age, with the whole stalker culture that came up in the late 80s, a few years after this film was made, the awareness of like stalkers and serial killers and psychos, and now we live in, of course, in an era of like mass shooters and terrorists. Is this something that I'm just watching this and I'm reading it through kind of like a contemporary viewpoint? Is his behavior really not strange? Is it kind of normal what he's doing? Is it kind of cute? Is it kind of basically a meet cute? And no, I think it's kind of strange. I think for Sigourney Weaver's character to kind of be enchanted by it at all is a little tough to swallow. And there's the aspect of it where she's kind of interested in finding out what the story is he might have to offer her, and that kind of is kind of presented as part of her motivation for wanting to get to know him better, is that she thinks he might know more about the crime. And I guess you could argue from that, a natural relationship might develop, but it's just a kind of a big stretch. I think it's the kind of stretch that if the film had been better constructed overall, you might give it a pass. But because the film is struggling so much, with its narrative that faults like that kind of stand out more. And you kind of, you kind of walk away like, all right, she comes from this really wealthy background. She's a successful reporter. That's a, I never worked in the reporting field, but I've worked, obviously with the School for Communications, and we studied journalism, and I've worked jobs in film, so I very much understand that mindset and what that must be like to be a high stakes, high pressure reporter, with a big position on a major city network, and the idea of like her, kind of starting to fall for a janitor, who, that's what he does. That's his whole thing. He works as a janitor. Yeah, he's kind of charming and he's not an idiot, but like those two worlds are so incredibly different. If you're going to sell to me the idea that she's going to be interested in a guy with this kind of background, that they're going to be able to find something to like bridge the gap so that they can relate to each other, because that's a huge gap. Their lives, their jobs, their interests, their social backgrounds, everything is so different. So to buy the idea that they could be kind of interested in each other, truly interested in each other, you really got to put some work into selling that. And the film doesn't do that either. It just always, with it's the kind of thing that as you're watching the movie, you don't know what the ending is going to be yet, but you're like, okay, there's one possible ending we know is going to be that they're going to be happily ever after. That's the way a lot of these genre films go. I mean, could two people like that ever really, truly live happily ever after? I mean, I'm a big fan of the podcast. I think I mentioned it before, the Rewatchables, which is does a great job in dissecting movies with hugely popular reputations. And they kind of break down the movies they watch into different categories. And one of the things they ask about the movies they watch is what happens the next day. In other words, the film ends. We see the end of the film's storyline, and then we ask ourselves, okay, then what happens after this? Where will these characters go? What happens to Morgan Freeman after the end of Seven? What happens to Brad Pitt at the end of that movie? And this is one of those films where like as you're watching it, you're like, okay, I can see that this might end. I don't know how it's going to end, but it might end with them, happily ever after. Like, really, what does happen the next day? Let's say that, this crisis that is central to the plot of this movie is resolved. What happens to these two? How do they go on and live a life together where, she's basically working a job that would, in all reality, be, high pressure and nonstop. Like, that's the kind of job where you're working. You're not just doing 40 or 50 hours a week. You're probably doing like 60, 70 hours a week. You're always on call, always having to travel. Um, you're interacting with people at like the upper echelons of business and culture and popular entertainment, and then your significant other is just spending all day cleaning in office buildings. And I just don't. And that by no means is a dig at either one of those professions. You want to be a reporter or a janitor, nothing wrong with that either way. But for those two to kind of come and meet together, can it happen? Absolutely. There are obviously countless stories of that kind of thing happening. But you're trying to convince me within the 90 to 100 minutes of a movie that might be able to happen. That's a whole different thing altogether. And you have to really put the work in to make that happen. Can you do that? Can you sell that idea in a film? Absolutely. But like I said, in a film that's already struggling just to be good at its most basic responsibility, which is a suspense film, then secondary obligations of selling the believability of your characters and their relationships, you're probably not going to hit on those either. So it's definitely a film that, but it falls again into that whole category of movies that, even though I do not call it a good movie, I enjoyed watching it. There's just something about the suspense genre of this time. There seem to be all these movies coming out at this point, which the better known ones would have been like what De Palma was doing, but there's kind of like these almost, I guess you could say, Hitchcockian films that were big at this point. And probably like I said, like when De Palma was really hitting it in the mid-70s, he was starting to make this happen with stuff like Obsession, and moving on to stuff like Trust to Kill and Blowout. And then you had films like this and Still of the Night and Last Embrace, and you move on to movies like Fatal Attraction and into the 90s, Basic Instinct and Disclosure, basically all the Michael Douglas stuff. I mean, there's this really good run of like probably 20 years, maybe 25 into like the late 90s, but I think the high point is kind of looked at as that like 25, 20 like 20-year period, I'm sorry, mid 70s to mid 90s, where like the whole suspense genre and the John Grisham adaptations and stuff like Presumed Innocent, and then you had movies like The Fugitive, where it was like that was like on a whole other level of popularity and critical reaction. But this kind of era was really hot for like the suspense film, and it was a lot of different directors basically filling the void of Hitchcock that he had been kind of the big guy known for that kind of stuff back in the day. Him and I think you got to give some shout out to Stanley Donen as well for stuff like Charade and to a lesser extent Arabesque. But De Palma was kind of the big name at this kind of thing. But yeah, you had all these other films coming out at that time. So to watch a movie that's an example of that kind of film from that era, that's kind of the era where that genre really was popular again. Even though this is not one of the more successful entries into that, it's still rewarding to watch it. And again, just something as basically as just seeing 80s, seeing the big city in the 80s shot on film. Because it's 1981, just that aesthetic. Even though, again, I wouldn't say there's anything necessarily noteworthy about the cinematography, the production design of this film, but there is just still something I think rewarding about seeing an example of this type of film that was so popular. Even if, again, not one of the not reference material at all, but still, you don't. I didn't regret having watched it. So this marked an early credit for the careers of some of the key people involved. This was Hurt's second film. He only his second movie, following up on Altered States. And for Sigourney Weaver, it was just her fourth movie. She had the small part in Annie Hall. She had had a supporting part in a lesser known movie called Madman, and then had been in Alien, which of course was a huge hit. And this was her first movie after Alien. And now Pamela Reed, as we mentioned before, who I'm definitely a fan of. This was only her third theatrically released movie following Walter Hill's The Long Riders and Jonathan Demme's Melvin and Howard. The film was originally to be titled The Janitor, and that is what it ended up being released as in the UK because they had already had some films titled Eyewitness. And for a little while, actually, they changed the title again in the US. They were as a working title to The Janitor Doesn't Dance before finally landing on Eyewitness. The film did not do too well at the box office. It grossed a couple $1 million at least less than its budget. It was a budget rate. Different sources either cite it as 6.5 or 8.5 million, but it only brought in at the box office 4.5. So it definitely did not do much for 20th Century Fox, but obviously didn't really hurt the careers of anyone involved. Hurt would go on The Body Heat would be his next movie, and that would begin this whole collaborations with Lawrence Kasdan, and of course Sigourney Weaver still going strong, and Peter Yates would get another Best Director nomination after this with The Dresser. So did not derail anyone's careers. So I think that's it for now. A little bit of a shorter episode this week, but that doesn't, have any reference on quality, we hope. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Carpet City Cinema. To continue to show us some love by way of your interactions with whatever platform you are listening to this on, be it YouTube, Spotify, iTunes. Give us the love. Give us the best reviews you possibly can. And until next week, take care.